to consider this. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, Australia's government is sticking firmly to a position that there is no direct link between climate change and the devastating bushfires we've seen recently. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his Emissions Reduction Minister Angus Taylor have said that Australia does not need to cut carbon emissions more aggressively to limit global warming, even after the bushfire disasters. Now, joining us on the line to discuss this further, we have Kean Wong, Malaysian journalist based in Sydney. He was also a former Parliament correspondent for several Australian newspapers. Thank you for joining us, Kean. Good evening. Now, before we get into the political debate, I'd like you to begin with a look at the facts on the ground that perhaps you'd like Malaysians who are observing from the outside, from a distance, to understand about what's happening right now in Australia.
The thing that makes it so unprecedented and scary for Australians as well as Malaysians who live in Australia or anyone else around the world is the fact, the scale of these fires. I mean, we were all very worried about the 2+ million, hectares, acres of the Amazon that went up in flames a few years ago. And now, we have at this stage about 12 million acres that have gone up in flames so far, and so we're talking about 6 times the size of the Amazon fires. It's huge. And the other thing that I think in terms of scale and proportion is that it's estimated that, about half to 2/3 of Australia's annual emissions budget has just gone up in smoke, literally just like that, in the past month. So it's massive in scale, and smog levels, for instance, are really high. In Canberra, where I long lived and worked, we, have seen the air quality index, about several times higher than, say, Beijing ever was. And in the past week, Canberra's smog pollution reading, air pollution reading, has been rivaling New Delhi to claim the top spot in the world.
Again, tell us a little bit about the surprise factor. Were Australians surprised by the size of this, considering that you've had in Australia a history of dry seasons resulting in fires and such? I mean, what was different this time, and were people caught off guard? I
think the government certainly has proven to have been incompetent in this whole process and have been caught off guard. Federal government, state governments as well, by the looks of it. The scale of it, I think, would have caught a lot of people by surprise. But on the other hand, we've had climate change reports, federal climate change reports, Australian government environment reports, scientific bodies that are Australian government, even the Australian Bureau of Meteorology have been predicting and forecasting extreme weather, dry conditions, out-of-control fires for the best part of a decade already. We can go back 10 years at least. We can even go back as recently as about a year ago to the last several months, where the group of national fire chiefs, current retired ones, recently retired ones, who are all experts in fighting bushfires, were seeking a meeting with the Prime Minister and the federal government 2 or 3 times, and were turned down, warning of such catastrophes to come. And here we are.
All right. So, Ken, the government has said that they're not going to be, cutting carbon emissions more aggressively. Now, the question is, can you help us understand both sides of the debate and whether there's support for these kind of remarks?
Well, if we were to go with opinion polls, maybe there isn't, both sides of the debate much anymore. I mean, you've got a small rump of climate change denialists. But the majority of Australians have proven, poll after poll, to be very worried about climate change, about the climate emergency. So the question then is the disconnect maybe between the government and, the government And how this has translated to, a slim one-seat majority at the most recent federal elections in May last year. And, how the Prime Minister himself, Prime Minister Morrison, has been among those leading climate change deniers of recent times. And, his mandate, of course, is very slim. And, it was an election as well, in a way climate change defined election that was full of fears, whipped up, and many people facing the insecurity of jobs, of inequality, and all of this has arisen from, a flatlining economy, which a lot of people accept needs to transition towards a renewable energy future.
Well,
and of course,
Ken, on that note, yeah. Ken, I have read that the government has used the economy as, I guess, a rationale for not wanting to do more to cut back emissions. So it's saying that this will hurt Australia's exports of coal and gas. Australia, I understand, overtook Qatar as the world's top exporter of liquefied natural gas. So does the economy rationale, persuade Australians?
I think it's rather mixed. I mean, to be fair, I think lots of Australians may not be entirely informed of what proportion of the economy might be reliant on fossil fuel exports. But overall, the question then arises with this sort of climate emergency and catastrophe is that what does it cost not to address climate change? Is it cheaper, for instance, to spend the billions now necessary to address this problem? You've got, forecasts now of double-digit drops in agricultural produce, of the economy actually possibly going into recession because of the catastrophic damage and the rebuilding that needs to occur. And what does it do to blow out the budget bottom line?
On that note, Kean, help us understand, Scott Morrison chided the federal opposition, the Labour Party, for its plans in terms of moving to a less carbon-dependent future, saying it's uncosted and it's going to cost jobs and so on and forth. What exactly, is anybody putting a number exactly on the length of time it's going to take to recover from these devastating fires that are, in some sense, not petering out yet?
Well, nobody really has put a number on that, partly because the fires, there's still fires that are out of control. And I think the worrying one, for instance, the most recent, just one example, is there are now coal seam fires in the big coal mining districts. And coal seam fires, underground, very hard to put out, and out of control. I mean, we don't seem to have a very good gauge or control as to the scale of this still. But I think the impact on the economy is very real, and the government needs to come to terms with many reports of its own experts over the last decade, where the cost is huge if you don't address the climate emergency, the climate change problem, rather than put it off. And now you have the catastrophe, and it will take billions to rebuild. And then there's the question of is any of these areas now insurable?
Kean, in the last minute that we have, clearly the human cost, with 25 dead so far, also including firemen. But what about flora and fauna, the devastation to the landscape? What is your sense of what's happened?
I think it's terrible. I mean, basically, they've now estimated about 500 million, that's like 500 million, fauna, animals, native animals and livestock have perished in these fires so far. There are native koala populations, for instance, that are now endangered. I don't think they've done an assessment of other native endangered species so far, so that's huge. The question is, of course, with the ongoing drought, how many generations will it take to regrow these forests? I mean, for me personally, I feel very sad that the only bush and the bushwalking that my kids have ever known in the south coast of New South Wales are gone forever. I mean, all we have now is black scorched earth.
Well, that sounds really tragic, and our hearts go out to all Australians fighting the fires and the impact over there. Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your insights with us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the show for this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for tonight. Thank you for watching, and good evening.